1973, the Vietnam War wasn't over, not for another 2 years, but the troops were coming home, and they brought the war home with them. A hero's welcome? It didn't happen. Not for these guys. The lucky ones came home, and no one even noticed.
No one was there to greet me at the airport, and I just quietly slipped back in, and no one said boo. I very quickly learned to forget about telling anybody I had been in the military, because if you brought it up, it garnered pretty negative looks and responses, and so I just swept it under the table and tried to move on.
Moving on wasn't going to be easy. There was help if you knew where to look for it. Rochester was one of a few good places. Just 17 cities in the country that backed a Veterans Outreach Project, a program to help with finding jobs and keeping vets off the street. It was the right idea, but after 6 years, funding was running out. In 1979, it was Tom Cray, a Vietnam veteran himself, who was in charge of the project. He knew it was too soon to end it. He knew that veterans like him needed more help.
And it wasn't until the 1980, after the Iranian hostages were released, that we really went public with this idea that we have a whole section of a population here who has been treated as second-class citizens, this veteran community. I mean, here are Iranian hostages that were held hostage for 180 days or so, and they're being treated like heroes, and they get a hero's welcome. Well, even here in our community, we have over 27,000 veterans that have come back and have been held hostage by unemployment, by inadequate health care, by inadequate mental health services. We've been held hostage, and we need to do something to treat them and welcome them home.
A handful of guys together made themselves the Veterans Outreach Center, where veterans were helping other veterans. They never called the same place home for more than a few months at a time, and they never knew if they could even afford to keep the lights on wherever they were. But every vet who found them knew these guys and their way of helping vets was different.
Tom Cray was really very active in running this place in the early days, and he was much more interested in equipping veterans with fishing poles rather than fish. And he wanted us to learn how to handle a fishing pole so we could fend for ourselves rather than be there with our hand out on the dole. And I think that was always the goal from the beginning, was to help veterans get back to being a whole person and being self-sufficient.
It wasn't easy, and times were tough. More than once, there wasn't enough money in the bank to even pay the employees. But they kept showing up because this was more than just a job to them.
I think what attracted and made this an effective place was that the guys and the people that worked here and that were associated with it, with things that went on here, were involved because they fell in love with this place. And why they fell in love with it was that because there was a connection made. You know, people that were here, it was not a us against them kind of attitude. It's a, hey, we're together. You know, I'm not saying I've achieved, but I'm working, and I'd like to work with you. You know, and I'll share with you what I've learned.
The Vietnam vets here were making news. Everybody was watching. What would they do next? They wanted to be understood. They wanted a chance to prove themselves as good guys who just followed orders to fight this war. One day the phone rang and they got their chance. Someone was going to give them a house, a place to call home, right over there on South Avenue.
It wasn't much of a house to begin with. It was pretty derelict, definitely in need of serious scraping, painting, all kinds of work inside and out, but we thought it was gorgeous.
Here you had a bunch of Vietnam veterans helping Vietnam veterans. This was their place. They were involved from the beginning in building this beautiful house. If you saw it back in the day, it was a shambles. And veterans would come here. They'd spend all day here. They'd sleep with sleeping bags to work the next day to fix this place up. So it became something that they could invest themselves in. And once it got operational, it was a place where they could come and talk with other Vietnam veterans about some of the readjustment issues that they were having, and they felt very, very comfortable here.
We connected with each other, but we were also, once again, committed to a purpose. Committed, hey, we had a mission. This is going to be our home. We are making a showcase for the community to show them what Vietnam vets can do. So there was therapy going on all of those years. As we were working with one another, sanding the floors and polishing and painting, putting up wallpaper, plumbing, everything. It was a very fun time.
By 1984, the house was a home again, and the veterans kept coming. Now, they were not just young guys from Vietnam. It was the whole community of veterans, World War II, Korea. This was the place where you came to be understood.
When they would start sharing their story, afterwards they say, "You really know what I'm saying, right? Don't you? You've been there." And you say, "Yeah, I've been there." And many times that's what gives a person hope.
The center was changing lives. Hundreds of men and women, too, were finding their way to this block. Here, the counseling was for veterans and for spouses, too. Wives, girlfriends, and families were all looking for support. They were veterans in their own right, still living and fighting this war right in their own homes.
You can't really treat the veteran unless you treat the unit. If you have somebody living in a household who has an issue like anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, it affects the marriage, it affects the kids, it affects the way they interact with one another. That's why it's so important to use a global approach.
For some, their problems got even worse. Many vets found themselves on the wrong side of the law. The center started a program reaching out to incarcerated vets. Just because these guys couldn't make it to the office didn't mean they weren't going to get help. And for many, having the help of the center meant that they got a break, staying out of jail for minor offenses as long as they were willing to do the work with the help that they got here. But what was it that they were working on? What was changing? Their families, their friends, everybody thought they were crazy. How could 27,000 kids with the same demons and ghosts all be crazy?
The urban myth at the time, if you will, was that it was the dregs of American society that were sent to Vietnam. So no wonder we were such a bunch of screwed up people, because we were already screwed up before we went. And people like psychologists like Dr. Wilson started doing studies and started to realize that that was not at all the case, but what we were experiencing was a result of our being immersed in a very traumatic military conflict. And history has since proven that not only were we not the dregs of society, we were the best.
They called it shell shock. They called it combat fatigue. Finally, they called it post-traumatic stress disorder, and that changed everything. The nightmares, the anger, the emotion, it had a name now.
We know a lot of people with post-traumatic stress have self-medicated. They can't sleep at night. They can't calm down. They can't face the day. And so sometimes they get into some situations with alcohol or with drugs. And so when they eventually come to see you, it's not just post-traumatic stress anymore. It's a substance program. It's having gone through 2 or 3 relationships, that have crumbled. It's going through 10 or 12 jobs. So the sooner we can get to somebody, the better. But everybody coming home likes to think, I'll just throw myself back into my life. Everything's okay. I'm not weak. I should be able to handle this stuff. And that's where the problems are.
The loose rap sessions and group therapy, it continued, and certified counselors were hired and offered clinical therapy for PTSD. Now even more veterans were looking for help. The VA itself acknowledged Veterans Outreach Center and the way that they were providing services, and the center became a leader in the community for PTSD and readjustment therapy.
The VA took a long time to understand Vietnam veterans and to embrace them, and to embrace the kind of problems that they had. PTSD people were skeptical of it in those days, that it was a real problem. So one of the things that made this place popular was that it wasn't the government. It was sort of the anti-government place to be. And in some ways it made it more fun.
By the early 90s, thousands of hours of counseling had already been given through Veterans Outreach Center, and people were noticing. Fundraisers and events with big-name celebrities were getting attention. The center used those chances to educate people on the veteran, teaching the public about how to help veterans find jobs and get back on their feet. Part of that idea became the Stars and Stripes Flag Store, a place run by the veterans to support the center. From a small start, the store grew with the center and eventually took its place right there on South Avenue with a front row view of what was happening in Rochester. More veterans were ending up on the street right here, homeless, and the center knew finding an answer here would help vets and families put the other parts of their lives back together. In 1996, the largest grant in the agency's history let them buy and renovate a new property, a shelter for homeless veterans. It took 4 years and a lot of fundraising to put it together, but in 1999, Richard's House was opened. In its very first year, it took 71 veterans off the streets and out of the cold. The late Reverend Thomas B. Richards was an advocate for Rochester's homeless and a veteran of the Air Force himself. In this shelter with his name on it, programs were offered that not only addressed addiction recovery and employment, but also reunited families.
Most of us who were involved in the Vietnam War were young. And we were disproportionately single, actually, you know. And so we came back and we were still in our 20s and, you know, life moved on. A lot of the people, particularly beginning in the Gulf War, were people who were farther along in their lives. They were reservists or other people who got called up, who had families. And so one of the things the Veterans Outreach Center began to realize is that the service we could provide had to be more than just to the veterans themselves. It was a family issue. Involving, you know, spouses and children and families who were caught up in this situation. And I think that was more true in the Gulf era. It's certainly true in the era today, at least as we perceived it in the Vietnam era.
As the Gulf War troops were starting to come home, they were coming back to the center too. It was a lot going on in this one house, so the center got bigger.
Every year, I mean, it was always a fight to, are we going to have enough funds to do what we need to do? How do we provide the services? Pretty dedicated group of people who were working very hard, doing a lot of services on shoestring budgets.
Partner agencies joined the team there, and the Department of Labor moved in to reach the veterans directly. Outreach programs were funded by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs to reach more homeless veterans for services. The center launched a job fair and found more ways to get veterans back to work. And Operation Welcome Home became part of the center's message to the community, getting volunteers out when our service members were coming back to give them that welcome the Vietnam generation never had. After 30 years, Veterans Outreach Center was starting to hit a great stride.
The recognition that community-based organizations are the key has been a real plus. The VA has recognized that their services are limited in some ways, and that it's the community-based organizations that kind of have not a better understanding, but a different understanding of what's going on in that community. And clearly, you know, for Rochester, and we have great veterans organizations here, not just VOC. So I think it's, you know, the recognition that if they give the money to the local providers, we can find a way to put it to better use and work in conjunction with those programs like the VA in order to serve veterans in a much broader range.
The center was ready to grow again. The Campaign for Veterans in 2004 launched a fund to expand right here along South Avenue. The Charles P. Galisano campus and Comfort Street renovation broke ground in 2006, and within 1 year, this building was up with a bigger technical center and a computer lab, doubling the office space for counseling and programs. By now, more than 30,000 veterans had come to the center. More counselors were here for wellness and readjustment counseling. More veterans were part of legal intervention services through Veterans Court, a program Rochester was second in the country to adopt that is now a nationwide event. Today's veterans had many of the same problems as the generations before them, but the center was working harder to meet more of them. New programs were started, like creative arts therapy, peer-to-peer mentoring, financial coaching, and education counseling. A federal program to end veteran homelessness brought the largest grant the center had ever earned. More than 700 new veterans to the center had their lives changed just because of that. But some things will never change.
The Veterans Outreach Center is home. When they're coming home from deployments, they walk through our doors, they get that sense of connectedness, the sense of connection, the sense of belonging, and they're amongst their friends, they're amongst other veterans. They speak a common language. And beyond that, they have the services here that they're seeking, and they come to them without any strings attached, no barriers, no bill that's going to show up in the mail, or any stigma or any sense that they owe something more.
It's like a home to many.
We've kind of been around each other for a very, very long time. We certainly appreciate everything that the Veterans Outreach Center does and continues to do and has done. They've been the focal point in this community that gave Vietnam veterans a place to go.
The community somewhere along the line here embraced the place. The Vietnam veterans were embraced eventually by this community, and this place has been embraced, and that's why it's still here.
We keep creating veterans that have issues that need to be addressed, and that's not going to stop. And if we're right on the 20-year impact, it'll be 20 years from now when the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq guys are going to really be looking at more severe need for services. I'd like to think that we'll still be here.
It's the bridge between the military and the civilian community, and there will always be a need for an agency like VOC who the veterans can connect with to be able to help them make that transition, and that's critical. It's a difficult transition to come from military to civilian life, and if there's any agency out there that can help that individual make that transition successfully, it'll be Veterans Outreach Center.
I believe the future for Veterans Outreach Center is going to be amazing. There are so many other communities looking at what we're doing. There's people around the nation watching, what is Rochester all about? Why is it that Veterans Outreach Center in Rochester, New York is doing such a great job at delivering services to their veterans when other communities are struggling? And I think our future is going to be helping other communities do exactly what we're doing here in Rochester. And on top of that, improving our posture and serving our own veteran population right here at home.